Picture this: you're walking through a shopping mall when you hear a woman with strong racist views accusing a black man of stealing. Everyone around you freezes in anticipation as the police arrive. But here's the twist no one expected: the police decide to look at the CCTV footage. What will they discover? Don't miss your chance to see how the shocking story unfolds. What do you think the video will show? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. When the police arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The woman, hunched over in anger, was pointing at a black man standing nearby and accusing him of stealing her phone. People around her began to whisper and mutter, some clearly doubting her words, but most were on her side, trusting her accusations simply because she was white and the accused was not. The police, realizing that the situation required objectivity, offered to review the surveillance footage. The woman was confident that the video would confirm her accusations, and her confidence only grew when the officers headed toward the monitors. With each frame, the situation became more and more tense. The first recordings began to appear: the man moving around the shopping center, making purchases and talking to sellers. Time passed, and the woman became increasingly nervous. Her confidence began to dissipate. And then, as the video approached the moment when, in her opinion, the theft occurred, all eyes were glued to the screen. It turned out that there was no theft or even suspicious behavior on the tape. In fact, the man had not even gone near the woman's bag. She was in complete shock when she discovered that her accusations were baseless. The police found nothing to support her claims and the man was acquitted. The woman's face was filled with fear and shame when the truth was revealed. When the police finally left, the woman tried to justify herself, but her excuses sounded more and more strained. Meanwhile, the man stood there, realizing how quickly a life can change when you are wrongly accused. When the CCTV footage was finally reviewed and the police confirmed that there was no evidence of guilt, the situation seemed to be resolved. The man who had been standing there waiting felt a huge sense of relief. The people around him began to move away, and the mall returned to its normal atmosphere. However, unexpectedly, after the police were about to leave, one of the mall employees approached them with a worried expression on his face. He reported that a serious error had been found on the cash register. Upon checking the records, it turned out that money had gone missing from a nearby store that same day, and surveillance footage showed suspicious activity that coincided with the time the woman had been shopping. The police officers, returning to the scene, decided to check this information. The woman, realizing that her false accusations could be used against her, began to panic. Soon, new information appeared on the scene. The recording showed that the woman was indeed involved in shoplifting, but not with this particular person. The questionable actions were recorded and detected by the security system. Meanwhile, the store employee provided additional information. He recognized the woman because she had previously made purchases using cards with fake information. It soon became clear that her real goal was not only to frame someone else for theft, but also to divert attention from her own crimes. The woman planned to use her lies to create chaos and cover her tracks. Ultimately, after an investigation, it was discovered that the woman was involved in a theft and fraud scheme that spanned multiple stores. Her entire phony theatrics of theft allegations was just part of her plan. In reality, her actions had far more serious consequences than she could have imagined. When the case was uncovered, the man who had been the victim of her false accusations became a key witness in the trial. Police and the public were shocked that one deception could have such a wide-ranging impact. The story left a deep mark on the community, serving as a reminder of how easy it is to be deceived and the importance of acting on facts rather than emotions and bias. After police checked the footage and found out the woman's allegations were false, the public was shocked. But the story didn't end there. Events unfolded that brought attention to deeper issues of racism and bias. The man who was the victim of false accusations decided not to remain silent. He organized a press conference to tell his story, highlighting how racial bias can lead to catastrophic consequences. His speech was powerful in its description of how easy it is to become a victim of injustice when society and its institutions are subject to racial stereotypes and bias. The incident sparked a wave of discussions on social media and in the media. People began sharing their own stories about how racism had affected their lives and how often they had encountered similar situations. The the man's story became a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice, opening the eyes of many to how often invisible barriers and biases become the cause of real fear and humiliation. Soon after, the case attracted the attention of human rights organizations and local authorities. The city initiated a series of public lectures and seminars on racism and discrimination. The city administration began working on new measures aimed at training police officers and service workers to prevent similar incidents in the future. The woman who had initially been the source of the conflict began to understand the scope of her actions. Her false accusations became a topic of discussion not only in the court system but also in public circles. During the trial, it became clear that her motives were deeper than simply a desire to apologize for her actions. The woman was part of a more complex web of racist beliefs and biases that she carried within herself. Her theft conviction was just one element of her wider problems with racism. Court hearings revealed how she had repeatedly expressed prejudiced views and discriminated against different groups of people in her life and work. As a result, the man who was the victim of her false accusations was able to use this situation to create a foundation aimed at helping victims of racism and supporting educational programs aimed at combating bias. This foundation began to receive support from various organizations and individuals, and became a symbol of hope for change and improvement in society. What began as a case of false accusations led to widespread public debate and action. It showed how a single incident can become a catalyst for meaningful change and highlighted the need for ongoing work to eliminate racism and discrimination in society. As attention to the incident increased, the situation began to evolve even faster. The man, who had become a symbol of the fight against racism, began actively collaborating with various organizations and human rights defenders to strengthen his foundation and expand its influence. He organized public events, panel discussions, and educational programs that attracted the attention of both local residents and national media. The foundation, created to help victims of racism, quickly gained popularity and recognition. With the funds raised, trainings were organized for police officers and private sector employees to raise their awareness of racial bias and teach them how to deal with such situations without bias and discrimination. These trainings included role-playing, discussions of real cases, and interaction with victims of racism, which allowed participants to understand the complexities and emotions associated with such cases in practice. The man also began collaborating with educational institutions, introducing lessons on racial equality and social justice into school curricula. Special classes were held in schools, where students were taught the importance of respecting differences and how biases and stereotypes can ruin lives. Since his campaign, the community has begun to see real change. More people are willing to openly discuss issues of racism and discrimination. Local governments have begun to support initiatives to improve relations between different racial and ethnic groups, as well as to create safe spaces for all citizens. However, the story was not without its challenges. The woman whose actions became a catalyst for the entire movement continued to resist. After realizing the scale of the consequences of her actions, she tried to distance herself from her past actions and justify herself to society. As a result, her legal and social position worsened. Her actions were recognized not only as racist, but also as an attempt to manipulate the situation for her own benefit. There has been intense public and human rights debate on how to prevent similar incidents in the future, leading to new bills aimed at tougher penalties for racist actions and false accusations, as well as better mechanisms for verifying facts and evidence. Ultimately, what began with a false accusation and racist bias led to important changes. The man who became a victim became a leader of change, and his fight for justice helped to awaken public consciousness and contribute to real improvements in society. His efforts showed that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found, and that one personal tragedy can be the beginning of significant social change. After the foundation became successful and society began to take action against racism, the life of the man who became a symbol of the fight for justice took new turns. His life seemed to have meaning and purpose, but behind the scenes of this apparent victory, a drama unfolded that threatened to destroy everything he had built. One day, While the man was holding an important planning meeting for the foundation's new educational project, his world suddenly turned upside down. He received an anonymous message informing him of a new revelation that his own past was not as spotless as he had made it out to be. The message claimed that the man himself had once been involved in minor crimes and had had several run-ins with the law in his youth, which could undermine the credibility of his work and reputation. These reports soon became public knowledge. The media and opposition groups began to launch a campaign to discredit the man. Headlines appeared that claimed that the man had allegedly concealed his criminal past to cover up his true intentions. This information was not only shocking, but also destructive to the reputation and work of the foundation. The man was in shock and panic. He had never hidden his past, but the very fact of its existence could work against him. His former lawyers, who had worked on his case in his youth, began making vague and ambiguous statements, adding fuel to the fire. Former acquaintances began speaking out about his past, and soon a whirlwind of scandal and discontent formed around him. His family and friends were shocked and supportive, but also worried that the scandal could destroy everything he had built. His wife, who had always been his rock, began to feel pressure and fear for the future of their children. The woman involved in the original incident took advantage of the situation and began publicly accusing him of attempting to manipulate and falsify. At this point, the man decides he needs to come forward and confront the situation head-on. He holds a press conference where he speaks honestly about his past. He explains that he made mistakes in his youth, but that he learned from them and has since changed completely. He addresses the public, calling for forgiveness and understanding, and emphasizes the importance of judging people by their current actions and changes, not just their past. This frank admission did not immediately solve all the problems. The drama continued, and public opinion was divided. As a result of the pressure, the foundation faced financial difficulties, and political opponents used the situation to criticize and try to destroy the efforts to combat racism. However, even in this dark phase of history, the man did not give up. He continued to work on the foundation's projects, attracting support from those who believed in him and in the importance of fighting racism. Little by little, through sincerity and hard work, he was able to restore trust and support the foundation's work. People began to understand that true strength and greatness lies in the ability to admit one's mistakes and strive for better. The man's story, despite all the trials and drama, became an even more powerful symbol of the fight for justice and change. His sincerity, resilience, and willingness to take on challenges helped refocus public attention on the important issues of equality and human dignity. In doing so, he confirmed that even in the most difficult situations, there is room for growth and change, and that true justice requires not only struggle, but also the courage to be honest with oneself and others. After the man confessed his past, his life seemed to stabilize again. Although he continued to face criticism and distrust, the support of loyal supporters helped him recover and continue his work. The foundation began to attract attention and funds again, but hidden dark forces began to operate again. One day, after receiving a disturbing message from an anonymous source, the man discovered that his trusted supporters and foundation colleagues were being targeted. Their personal information, addresses, and photos began to spread on social media with threatening and racist comments. It soon became clear that radical groups were involved in these attacks, using this information to organize acts of intimidation and violence against those who advocated for equality and justice. The man tried to contact the authorities, but their response was insufficient to prevent the violence. The police, faced with an overburdened system and limited resources, were unable to quickly and effectively protect those who were being threatened. The situation became increasingly tense, and many of the foundation's employees began to receive threats against their families. At the same time, new accusations began to appear in public discourse, claiming that the man and his foundation were part of a complex network of political manipulations and financed by hidden interests. These accusations contributed to further inflaming passions and mistrust in society, leading to an increase in extremist sentiments and acts of violence. The man and his team decided to take decisive action. They began working with lawyers, human rights organizations, and international observers to create a defense strategy and draw attention to the threats they were facing. They organized a meeting with media and human rights organizations to give a detailed account of what was happening and to mobilize the international community to support their fight. At this point, the woman who had started the cycle suddenly came forward. She publicly apologized for her actions and acknowledged that her biases were deeply rooted in her own personal fears and mistakes. She also provided evidence that radical groups were using her as part of their strategy to create chaos and incite hatred. These groups, she said, were manipulating her and using her case as an excuse to further fuel racial tensions. The collaboration with the woman brought further attention to the problems of systemic racism and manipulation of public debate. It soon became clear that radical groups were indeed using her and the false accusations for their own purposes. This information helped increase pressure on extremist groups and expose the scale of their activities. Public attention to these facts led to mass protests and demonstrations in support of the fight against racism. People from all over the country and the world took to the streets to express their support and demand real change. This movement strengthened social ties and gave new impetus to the fight against racism and discrimination. The man, despite having endured enormous hardships and trials, found himself at the center of a powerful social movement. His efforts and steadfastness inspired many and helped draw attention to the importance of fighting racism and preventing manipulation and violence. What began with one false accusation led to a global conversation and action against racism, bias and radicalism. Ultimately, the fight became a symbol of hope and change, showing that even in the darkest moments, light can be found and that true justice requires constant effort, honesty and determination. With public attention and mass support, the anti-racism movement continued to gain momentum. The man at the center of it all became one of the most influential voices in the fight. He attracted the attention of international human rights organizations and politicians, and his foundation began to attract major investments and support. However, a new threat appeared on the horizon. Some radical groups, realizing that their influence was waning, began to take desperate steps. They began organizing covert campaigns to undermine the credibility of the man and his foundation. Fake news began to appear on social media, claiming that the foundation was using money for personal purposes and manipulating data for political purposes. Suddenly, the man and his team became victims of several large-scale cyber attacks. Personal data, emails, and financial reports of the foundation were stolen and published online. This data leak led to accusations of financial irregularities and attempts to discredit the work of the foundation. The media again began to deploy a campaign based on this false data. With the pressure and uncertainty mounting, the man and his team began to develop a defense strategy. They hired leading cybersecurity experts to investigate the data breach and neutralize the threats. At the same time, they continued to work actively with lawyers and advocacy groups to refute the false allegations and restore their reputation. Meanwhile, a division emerged in society. Some supported the man and his foundation, admiring their resilience and determination, while others began to doubt their integrity. This division became the subject of heated debate and controversy in public and media circles. One day, when the situation seemed to be on the verge of disaster, the man received an unexpected offer from an anonymous source. The letter claimed that the key to exposing all manipulations and exposing radical groups was in the records that were stolen during cyber attacks. This source offered cooperation, but with the condition of complete confidentiality and security. The man agreed to cooperate and soon discovered that the stolen recordings contained evidence of connections between radical groups and high-profile political figures. These connections pointed to the systematic use of racist and extremist ideas for manipulation and political purposes. When these findings were released to the public, the scandal engulfed high-profile politicians and influential figures who had ties to radical groups, leading to widespread political repercussions including resignations, investigations and reforms. The man and his foundation found themselves at the center of a new phase of the fight for justice. With their help, significant progress was made in exposing the manipulation and corruption associated with racism. Public opinion began to turn in their direction, and support grew again. The man's story became a symbol not only of the fight against racism, but also of resilience and courage in the face of political manipulation and extremism. He became the embodiment of hope for change and an inspiration to those who continue to fight for justice and equality. In the end, what began with one false accusation led to profound social change and the exposure of systemic problems. It demonstrated that even in the most difficult and dark situations, there is an opportunity for meaningful change if we act with determination, honesty, and a commitment to the truth. After the data revealing the radical group's links to high-profile politicians was published, the world around the man and his foundation changed. The pandemonium caused by the scandal reached its peak. The political elite, trying to minimize the consequences, began their counterattack. Soon, reports began to emerge that radical groups, despite the exposure, were planning large-scale revenge actions against those who exposed them. The unrest quickly turned violent. One evening, as the man and his team were meeting in their office to discuss their next strategy, they were attacked. Unknown gunmen, disguised as civilians, stormed the building and began shooting. The man and several Foundation employees managed to escape, but one of the key team members, a young woman, died in the horrific attack. Her death was tragic, and the public was shocked by the violence that had been unleashed in response to their efforts to combat racism. The tragedy not only heightened public outcry, but also led to an internal crisis within the Foundation. The man and the remaining team members were forced to rethink their actions and security measures. Every step was scrutinized, and the Foundation's employees were subject to constant threats and surveillance. Fear and uncertainty permeated their ranks, but they continued their work, knowing that they could not allow terror to stop their mission. Meanwhile, amid all this, new legal and political complications began to arise. Radical groups tried to confuse the case by presenting false evidence and creating new charges against the man and his foundation. They also tried to use the media to further fuel hatred and doubt, accusing them of manipulation and falsification. These efforts led to new levels of polarization and conflict in society. The man's family, especially his wife and children, began to suffer from constant pressure and threats. The death of his colleague and the constant attacks also had a serious impact on his mental state. He felt a huge responsibility for the safety of his loved ones and employees, and this feeling of guilt became a heavy burden. Against this background, internal conflicts in the team intensified, and some employees began to doubt the advisability of continuing to work, fearing for their lives. One day, at the climax of the crisis, the man received a new offer from an anonymous source. He had the opportunity to obtain information about who was behind the attacks and manipulations. This source offered cooperation in exchange for complete trust and the implementation of a complex plan. The man, finding himself on the edge, decided to take a risk and accepted the offer. In a complex operation involving secret meetings and dangerous manipulation, the man and his team obtained key evidence about who was orchestrating the attacks and racist campaigns. This data allowed them to uncover a network of corrupt politicians and radical groups who used violence as a means of control and manipulation. In the final phase of the investigation and exposure, the man found himself in even greater focus. But now this focus was on fighting for justice and restoring his reputation. He organized public appearances and press conferences to present evidence and hold those behind the abuse and manipulation accountable. This moment was the culmination of his fight, but it also brought new threats and dangers. The story ended on a tragic note when another key member of the team was killed, and the man himself was forced into hiding to protect his life and that of his family. The Foundation continued to operate, but was under threat, and public attention remained on edge. This tragedy became a landmark moment in the history of the fight for justice. The man and his team showed incredible resilience and courage despite unforeseen consequences and tragedies. Their work brought attention to important issues of racism and violence, leaving a legacy of struggle and sacrifice that became a symbol of hope and change in society. While hiding from threats, the man and his closest allies continued to work from the shadows, using secure channels of communication and secret meetings. Despite the increasing stress and constant danger, they did not lose sight of their main goal, exposing those responsible for the abuse and manipulation. The man, now constantly on the move and living in hiding, faced the difficult task of coordinating the team and protecting its members. The foundation, managed by temporary administrators, continued its work, but with limited resources and under constant pressure. The danger and tragedy had left deep marks on the morale of the staff. Their efforts to continue the work were tested not only professionally but also personally. Every action required caution. Every decision became critical. Soon, months after the murder of a key member of the team, the public unrest began to subside. Scandals, revelations and violence seemed to fade into the background, giving way to a new political cycle and changing priorities. However, the man and his team knew that the real fight was just beginning. Radical group leaders and corrupt politicians, despite being exposed, did not give up trying to maintain their influence and reputation. The man and his team found new evidence indicating that their subversive activities were continuing. These groups began manipulating public opinion, sowing doubts and fears through fake media and fake news. It soon became clear that neither side was willing to back down. A new wave of accusations and counterattacks began in the public space, aimed at undermining the work of the man and his team. False accusations began to circulate again, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and mistrust. All this led to mass protests, which were organized by both supporters and opponents of the man. At this critical moment, when the situation reached its breaking point, the man received news that shook him to the core. As a result of one of the attacks by radical groups, his wife and children had been kidnapped and held hostage, which was part of a new plan to put pressure on him. This terrible news made him feel helpless and depressed. In a desperate attempt to bring his family back and defuse the threat, the man turned to his most trusted allies and human rights groups for help. Together, they devised a complex plan to rescue his family and expose the remaining conspirators. The operation required maximum effort and risk, including secret negotiations, undercover operations, and tense moments of confrontation. After days of nervous anticipation and dramatic events, the team was able to locate and free his family, but not without losses. During the rescue operation, one of the man's key allies was killed, adding another tragedy to their difficult fight. With mixed feelings of relief and grief, the man continued his fight, knowing that his personal losses were part of a larger fight for justice. Ultimately, the man and his team were able to see the job through, exposing the remaining radical groups and corrupt politicians. Their efforts led to massive reforms and a change in public consciousness. The tragedies they experienced made their fight even more meaningful and instructive. The story of a man full of struggle, loss and courage left a deep mark on society and became a symbol of hope and strength in the fight for justice. Although personal loss and tragedy continued to haunt him, he was able to find solace in the fact that his efforts had led to significant change and improved social justice. Ultimately, his story became a testament to how even in the darkest moments, light can be found and that true resilience is demonstrated by the ability to continue fighting for the greater good despite obstacles and challenges. When the man and his team were able to expose the remaining radicals and corrupt politicians, their actions became a turning point in the public fight for racial justice. Their efforts led to massive reforms in the political system and law enforcement. However, real impact and long-term change required much more than just exposure. A society shocked by the scale of corruption and violence faced a new challenge: how to integrate these lessons into life and prevent such tragedies from happening again. The man who had lived through so many trials understood that the process of change required not only legislative measures, but also a profound change in people's consciousness. The foundation, led by the remaining team members, began a major outreach program. They launched a series of educational initiatives aimed at overcoming racial bias. These programs included meetings and trainings at schools, universities, and businesses. They developed interactive lessons that covered both historical aspects of racism and modern forms of bias. An important part of this work was the creation of platforms for those who had been victims of racism. The foundation supported the creation of psychological help centers and support groups where people could share their stories and find support. These centers also served as a place for active discussion and reflection on the events that had occurred, helping people cope with the consequences of racism and bias. However, not everything went smoothly. In response to these efforts, new counter-movements emerged. Extremist groups, seeing their influence diminish, began to actively campaign against educational programs and outreach initiatives. They organized demonstrations and spread disinformation in an attempt to dissuade people from participating in these events. A man who had experienced loss and suffering, he found himself back at the center of the fight. He continued to speak out publicly, using his personal stories and experiences to persuade the public to continue his work. He and his team also began collaborating with human rights organizations around the world to share experiences and resources. During this period, an important step was the initiative to create new legislation aimed at strengthening legal protections against racial discrimination and violence. The man's team worked with lawyers and politicians to create laws that required law enforcement agencies to be more transparent in their investigations and accountability for cases of racist crimes. At the same time, he began working on a documentary film that would tell the story of his experiences and their consequences. The film became an important tool for disseminating information and caused a wide public response. It showed real stories of people who suffered from racism and presented the work of the foundation, which highlighted important aspects of the fight against bias. The documentary attracted international media attention and generated a wave of support from celebrities, human rights activists, and public figures. It became a powerful tool in the fight for justice and became a symbol of hope for many people who face racism and discrimination. Meanwhile, internal conflicts and personal traumas continued to haunt the man. He felt that his life would never be the same as it had been before he began this journey, and that every action he took carried the weight of sacrifice and loss. But despite this, he continued to find the strength to move forward, knowing that his work was important. Eventually, the results of the foundation's work and public initiatives began to show. The system became more transparent, new mechanisms for monitoring and combating racism emerged, and public consciousness became more receptive to issues of equality and justice. While personal loss and hardship continued to be a part of his life, he found solace in the fact that his efforts had made a real difference. His story became a testament to the strength and resilience of fighting for justice. It showed that despite enormous challenges, the opportunity to change society for the better always exists, and that even in the darkest moments, light and hope can be found. The man, on the front lines of racial justice, faced new challenges despite the successes he had made. His foundation remained active, implementing educational programs and supporting victims, but with each step came new challenges. One day, the man received an anonymous tip that several former allies who had abandoned the foundation during difficult times were beginning to use their connections to undermine the reforms that had been achieved. These traitors were rumored to have made deals with radical groups to create new threats and hinder further progress. At this time, relations with the outside world also became more complicated. The government, although beginning to support reforms, came under pressure from political forces seeking to maintain the status quo. Negative campaigns against the fund continued, creating an atmosphere of tension and mistrust. Some key politicians and media outlets began to make accusations that the fund was allegedly using funding for secret political purposes, which again attracted attention and increased the polarization of public opinion. The man and his team began investigating the anonymous tip, which led to a surprising discovery. It turned out that among those trying to undermine their efforts was a woman who had once played a significant role in the original conflict. Her name was linked to groups that engaged in manipulation and violence. She used her influence and connections to create false documents and false testimonies aimed at discrediting the foundation and the new reforms. At the same time, internal disagreements within the foundation team reached a critical point. Some members began to question strategies and methods of work, which resulted in open conflicts and accusations. This tension, aggravated by external pressure, caused a new crisis within the foundation. The man, who again found himself at the center of these conflicts, had to make difficult decisions in order to maintain the unity and effectiveness of the team. To resolve the crisis, the man decided to hold an emergency meeting with key team members and close allies. At the meeting, he candidly laid out the current situation, discussed threats, and proposed a plan of action. He called for unity and a willingness to work together despite internal disagreements and external pressure. This meeting became a turning point, allowing the team to regroup and focus on a common goal. As part of his new plan, the man decided to create an independent commission to investigate the allegations against the foundation and its employees. This commission consisted of respected human rights activists, independent experts, and journalists. They conducted a thorough investigation that allowed them to refute the allegations and expose the fraud and manipulation organized by opponents of the reforms. At the same time, the man and his team began actively working to restore public trust. They organized public events where they openly discussed the results of the investigation and presented facts about their activities. These events attracted public and media attention, which helped to strengthen support for the foundation and its initiatives. However, the difficulties were not over. In recent months, the man and his team faced new forms of disruption and threats. Their work was under constant attack, and they continued to face attempts to undermine their efforts. Despite this, they did not give up and continued to fight for their goals. During this period, the man also began to actively engage in personal reflection and search for ways to cope with emotional burdens and psychological trauma. He began working with professional psychologists and therapists, which helped him find new sources of strength and maintain motivation. Eventually, with the support of dedicated allies and the persistent work of the foundation, public perception of the reforms became more positive. Gradually, the situation stabilized, and many initiatives began to bear real fruit. New educational programs began to operate, public consciousness continued to change, and the reforms began to bring long-awaited changes to the political and human rights spheres. The man's story became a landmark example in the fight against racism and bias, showing that even in times of crisis and tragedy, meaningful change can be achieved. His experience became an inspiration to many who continued to fight for justice, and his work helped create a more just and equal society. The man, who had endured many trials, continued to work to complete his mission and bring about lasting change in society. His work remained under close scrutiny, and every step the team took was met with both support and resistance. Despite this, he was determined and knew that his work was not yet done. After successfully exposing false allegations and building public trust, he focused on systemic work to eradicate racism. Realizing that changing public consciousness requires long-term efforts, he initiated a project to deeply research the causes of racial bias and develop solutions to eliminate it. The project involved creating a research group, analyzing data on racial bias, collecting evidence, and studying the social and economic factors that contribute to racism. In collaboration with universities and research institutions, the group developed recommendations for improving social policy. The foundation, which operated as a more structured organization, launched new programs. An important initiative was educational courses for schools and universities that taught students the history of racism, critical thinking, and empathy. These courses included real stories of people who had experienced racial discrimination. The foundation also organized lectures and workshops with experts and victims of racism, which became an important platform for sharing experiences and discussing strategies to combat bias. The man began actively working to create alliances with other organizations and activists. He initiated the creation of a coalition of human rights groups, entrepreneurs, educational institutions, and local authorities. These alliances helped expand the program's reach, secure funding, and mobilize public opinion. The combined efforts led to the creation of major initiatives aimed at improving living conditions and employment for marginalized groups. Despite the successes, new challenges were not long in coming. Protests against the foundation's reforms erupted in several cities, organized by radical groups seeking to undermine confidence in the anti-racism effort. The man and his team faced harsh criticism and threats, and their projects were vandalized. The events served as a reminder of how dangerous and difficult their work is. In response to the crisis, he changed tactics. Focusing on strengthening security and interaction with law enforcement, he organized meetings with local authorities and police departments to ensure the protection of the foundation's projects. New public information campaigns were also launched to debunk the misinformation spread by opponents of the reforms. The foundation used social networks and media to disseminate truthful information and mobilize supporters. Meanwhile, the foundation's work began to bear fruit. Examples of successful change emerged, such as new programs to support small businesses owned by minorities and anti-racism and inclusion courses in educational institutions. Many former victims of racism began telling their stories in the media and on public platforms, which became an important element of education and strengthening public consciousness. The man's personal recovery also became an important part of his life. He realized the need to pay attention to his own well-being and mental health. Working with therapists and engaging in sports and creative activities, he found solace and strength to continue his work. The man continued his work, knowing that the fight against racism is a never-ending process. His efforts and experiences became a symbol of resilience and determination in solving one of the most difficult social problems. His story continued to inspire people, and his work left a deep mark on society, emphasizing that true change is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. Despite the notable achievements and progress, deep internal divisions and struggles continued within the society. The man and his team found that their work had led to the emergence of new factions and movements that used racial issues for their own interests. While some people sincerely supported reforms and changes, others tried to use racism and prejudice as a tool for manipulation and political games. It soon became apparent that traditional methods of work based on education and legislative initiatives were not sufficient to solve all the problems. To achieve real change, it was necessary to involve the general public in active participation in the fight against racism, and not just rely on the work and initiatives of the foundation. The man, realizing that his work had deeper social roots, began actively seeking new approaches to solving the problem. He decided to focus on local communities, developing a strategy to create action groups that could address local issues and propose solutions that suited their specific conditions. These groups became the basis for creating local networks of mutual aid and support, which allowed for more effective identification and elimination of instances of racism in everyday life. One of the most notable projects was the initiative to create public forums where residents could openly discuss issues of racial bias and offer their ideas for improvement. These forums became a platform for constructive dialogue between different groups of the population and contributed to a deeper understanding of social problems. At the same time, he discovered that achieving lasting change required the active participation of young people. He began working with educational institutions to create student clubs and organizations focused on combating racism. These youth groups became important centers of activism and innovation, bringing new ideas and approaches to the foundation's work. But the new approach also faced serious challenges. In some regions, clashes between those who supported and those who opposed the reforms erupted, leading to violence and conflict. This was a stark reminder that change is not always easy, and that fighting for justice requires not only data and campaigning skills, but also the ability to effectively manage real conflicts. In response to these challenges, he decided to focus on strengthening communication and cooperation with law enforcement and local government. He launched new trainings for police officers and employees aimed at improving their understanding and working with racial bias. These trainings included real-life scenarios and examples to increase awareness and improve skills in dealing with conflict situations. In addition, the man continued his personal work on recovery and self-knowledge. He understood that his internal state directly affected his ability to lead such a difficult fight. Therefore, he began to actively engage in meditation and search for ways that helped him maintain internal balance and find inspiration in difficult times. These efforts have begun to bear fruit. In places where action groups have been established and forums held, real changes have begun to be seen. The situation in some regions has stabilized, and there are more opportunities for productive dialogue and collaboration. Still, the man knew that the path to full justice was still far away, but each step, each successful decision, and each new initiative became part of the larger mosaic of change he was trying to build. His story continued to evolve, and his work served as a constant reminder that the fight for racial justice is not just a mission, but an ongoing process that requires constant attention, innovation, and persistence. A man who had decided to dedicate his life to fighting racism faced a new wave of difficulties that led to tragic consequences and threatened all his efforts. One day, after another successful public action of the foundation, the man was informed about an explosion in one of the help centers, which had recently opened in one of the most problematic areas of the city. The explosion occurred at a time when employees and several victims of racism who had come for support were in the building. This attack resulted in numerous casualties and injuries, and the center was almost destroyed. The tragedy caused shock and horror among the public and called into question the safety of all future events of the foundation. The man was devastated. The loss of the foundation's employees and clients left a deep mark on him. He understood that the attack was organized by radical groups who were trying to undermine anti-racism efforts and create an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. This was not just an act of violence, but an attempt to stop progress and take society back. Following the attack, internal conflicts within the foundation escalated. The team, already tired from the constant struggle, faced new levels of stress and pressure. Some employees began to question the wisdom of continuing to work under such a threat. Internal disagreements spilled over into open conflict, leading to some of the team quitting or taking long leave. Emotional and physical exhaustion became apparent, and the foundation had to cope with this crisis amid public pressure. The man himself was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Sleepless nights, constant guilt over failing to protect his employees, and trauma from the losses began to take their toll on his mental state. He felt that his mission was under threat and began to doubt his ability to continue the fight. In the midst of the crisis and tragedy, the man received an unexpected offer of help from a group that had previously been considered an opponent of the foundation. The group, made up of former radicals who had moved away from violent actions, offered to help investigate the bombing and provide security for future initiatives. They said they had realized the error of their ways and wanted to contribute to the fight against racism to correct their past mistakes. The man was initially skeptical, but after careful vetting and consultation with trusted team members, he accepted the offer. This unexpected help became a significant resource in rebuilding the foundation and ensuring security. New allies provided information about potential threats and helped strengthen security measures at other centers and events. Meanwhile, public sentiment has grown even more tense. The attack on the center has led to increased violence and hostility toward reformists. Some cities have become arenas for clashes between protesters and radical groups. Against this backdrop, the fund has faced additional pressure from political figures who have begun to exploit the crisis for their own gain, accusing the fund of ineffectiveness and creating instability. The situation reached a critical point when new acts of violence and sabotage resulted in the deaths of several key activists of the foundation. These losses were a huge blow to the man and his team. In parallel, problems with funding arose when many sponsors began to withdraw their support due to fears for their safety. After this new wave of tragedies, the man began to feel that his personal life was in tatters. He lost close friends and colleagues, and the constant stress and guilt became overwhelming. Rebuilding the foundation became not just a difficult task, but almost impossible. His personal grief became inextricably linked with his professional difficulties, and he sank into a deep depression. During this difficult period, the man decided to take a break and take a vacation to try to deal with his own inner demons. He went to a secluded place for a while, where he was able to do some soul searching and find new sources of strength. This period was extremely painful, but it allowed him to look at his goals and reconsider his methods of work. The man's return to work was met with cautious optimism. He recognized that to achieve real change, he needed to rethink his strategy and methods. He focused on building more resilient structures to ensure safety, and building support from new allies who had proven their commitment to the cause. The foundation has relaunched with new initiatives to support survivors and promote reform. He began working on creating a mental health program for victims of racism and activists to help them cope with the effects of trauma and stress. Despite all the trials, the man continued to move forward, understanding that the fight for justice is not only a fight against external enemies, but also constant work on yourself. His story became an example of fortitude and the ability to overcome the most difficult circumstances, despite numerous tragedies and losses. After a series of tragedies and crises, the man and his team worked to rebuild the foundation, facing new challenges and finding ways to overcome difficulties. The explosion at the AIDS Center, which caused many casualties and destruction, shocked the community and called into question the safety of all future events. The attack was the result of radical groups seeking to undermine anti-racism efforts and create an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. Internal conflicts within the foundation escalated, and many employees began to question the wisdom of continuing to work. Emotional and physical exhaustion became apparent, and the man himself found himself on the verge of a nervous breakdown, immersed in a sense of guilt for failing to protect his employees and friends. At this difficult moment, the man received an unexpected offer of help from a group of former radicals who were now looking for a way to atone for their past mistakes. After carefully checking their intentions, the man accepted their offer. This help became a significant resource in restoring the foundation and ensuring security. New allies provided information about potential threats and helped strengthen security measures. However, public sentiment became even more tense when the attack on the center led to increased violence and hostility. The foundation faced additional pressure from political figures who began to exploit the crisis to their advantage, accusing the foundation of ineffectiveness and creating instability. The loss of activists and funding problems worsened the situation, creating the impression that the foundation was on the verge of collapse. The man initiated a complete overhaul of the foundation's internal structure, bringing in new crisis management and security specialists and improving its protection measures. The creation of a hotline system for reporting discrimination and violence was an important step in rebuilding trust. An important part of the recovery was a psychological support program for victims of racism and activists, which provided free counseling and therapy. The foundation relaunched its operations, launching new initiatives aimed at improving social inclusion and expanding opportunities for marginalized groups. These programs included support for small businesses and anti-racism education courses. New partnerships with corporate sponsors strengthened the foundation's financial base and helped implement new projects. However, the foundation faced a new threat when it was revealed that a media company had used its position to sabotage the foundation's efforts and spread disinformation. The man and his team launched a public campaign to expose corruption at the media company, which attracted public attention and supported the foundation in its fight to restore its reputation. During this difficult and dramatic period, the man also focused on his personal recovery. He began to actively engage in psychological rehabilitation and provide assistance to others who faced similar difficulties. Despite deep personal and professional trials, the man continued his work, learning from difficult situations and using new approaches to achieve the foundation's goals. The man's story is a testament to strength of spirit and resilience, and an important reminder that the fight for justice and equality is an ongoing process that requires courage and determination in the face of tragedy and adversity. With the foundation rebuilt and the work to combat racism continuing, it seemed that the situation was beginning to stabilize. However, an unexpected turn of events threatened all of the man's efforts and plans. Suddenly, a new crisis erupted, one that was far more complex and dangerous than any previous problems. One day, during an internal audit of the foundation's financial reports, a huge financial hole was discovered. Apparently, funds allocated for programs and initiatives began to disappear. Initially, external threats were suspected, but further investigation revealed that the problem was coming from within the foundation. It turned out that a high-ranking employee in charge of financial affairs was playing a double game. He used his position to hide illegal transactions and enriched himself at the expense of the foundation. His actions not only undermined the financial stability of the organization, but also jeopardized the safety and effectiveness of all programs. When the corruption was revealed, it caused a storm of public outrage. The man was forced to publicly acknowledge the problem and announce an internal investigation. There was a wave of criticism and suspicion that the fund had failed to ensure proper verification and control. The revelations of corruption led to a wave of dismissals and lawsuits. Some team members who were not involved in the shenanigans also came under pressure and were accused. This created even more tension within the fund and destroyed the fragile stability that had been restored. The investigation made a shocking discovery. It turned out that the corrupt official did not act alone, but was part of a larger, more complex network of criminal organizations that manipulated the finances of foundations and public organizations. This network used its resources to sabotage reforms and maintain racist structures in order to maintain its illegal income. This discovery left the man and his team facing a new threat. Criminal groups began active intimidation attempts to prevent further investigation. The man and his team found themselves in the middle of a complex game where every move could lead to new dangers. The man, realizing that his foundation and all its achievements could be destroyed, decides to act decisively. He turns to independent investigators and journalists to get support in exposing the criminal network and restoring trust in the foundation. He also works with law enforcement to ensure the safety of employees and protect them from threats. During this time, the fund had to review its operating methods and strengthen its internal processes to prevent similar incidents from recurring in the future. New controls and audits were introduced, and internal audit processes were improved. The public was shocked by the scale of the revelations, but also showed solidarity with the foundation. Media publications and investigations supported the foundations in the fight against the criminal network, which led to the arrest of several key figures from this organization. The foundation was able to restore its funding and continue working on its initiatives. A man who had lived through many tragedies and trials, he learned much from this crisis. He continued his work, but now with even greater determination and attention to detail. His efforts to restore the foundation, fight corruption and overcome new threats were a testament to his strength and courage. The man's story, despite all the tragedies and unexpected turns, continued to inspire and serve as an example of resilience and determination. His work became not only a symbol of the fight for justice, but also a lesson in the importance of honesty and commitment in the most difficult circumstances. As the foundation recovered and the crises were overcome, the man and his team continued their work, focusing on the underlying issues of racism, which continued to be a pressing and painful problem in society. Finding that the problems of corruption were only superficial symptoms of deeper systemic problems, the foundation decided to apply new approaches and strategies to combat racism. Following the crisis, the foundation decided to focus on the root causes of racism. This included examining the history and social structures that sustained racial discrimination. Instead of traditional events and campaigns, the foundation began developing educational programs aimed at deep understanding of the history of racism and its impact on modern society. Educational initiatives were launched, including courses and workshops for students, teachers, and community leaders. These programs offered not only facts and figures, but also personal stories of people who had suffered racism, which helped create an emotional connection and deepen understanding. The foundation realized that in order to make lasting changes, it was necessary to influence the younger generation. They developed a series of programs and events aimed at engaging young people in active participation in the fight against racism. These programs included both educational and practical elements, such as volunteer work, participation in social justice projects, and art exhibitions dedicated to the topic of racism. Young people began to actively participate in the creation and implementation of initiatives related to racial justice. They organized public events, discussions, and art projects that drew public attention to the problems of racism and discrimination. These actions allowed young people not only to understand their roles in society, but also to become active agents of change. The foundation began to actively work with various communities, especially in areas where racism and bias were most pronounced. They created platforms for dialogue between different groups, organized meetings and roundtables where people could openly discuss their experiences and biases. These discussions helped to establish a deeper understanding and find ways to solve problems together. One successful project was the Communities for Justice program, which brought together local organizations, activists, and entrepreneurs to work on projects aimed at improving living conditions and reducing racial bias. These projects included improving educational opportunities, creating jobs, and developing cultural events that promote integration. Despite the foundation's efforts, there were new moments of crisis. In one of the regions where the foundation was actively working to improve conditions, a series of incidents of racially motivated violence occurred. These events attracted public and media attention, and the foundation again found itself at the center of discussions and criticism. The man and his team used the situation as an opportunity to intervene proactively. They organized emergency events and actions to support the affected communities, and initiated large-scale awareness-raising and anti-racism campaigns. In response to the ongoing challenges, the foundation began working on new reforms. They proposed a number of legislative initiatives aimed at strengthening the protection of minority rights and improving the monitoring of racial discrimination. These initiatives included both changing existing laws and developing new regulations aimed at combating systemic racism. The foundation has also partnered with various public and private organizations to create joint programs on racial discrimination training and prevention. These programs are aimed at raising awareness among law enforcement officers, judges, and other public servants about the problems of racism and the need for a fair approach to all citizens. Despite all the trials and tribulations, the foundation and its team began to see the fruits of their labor. Educational initiatives, youth outreach, and community engagement began to yield visible results. People began to discuss racism more openly and actively participate in anti-discrimination initiatives. The man who became a symbol of the fight for justice continued to move forward, inspired by the fact that despite all the tragedies and difficulties, his work continues to have a positive impact on society. The foundation, now even more sustainable and focused on the real needs of people, continued its mission, finding new ways to combat racism and promote social justice. The story of the man and his team became an example of how determination and perseverance can overcome the most difficult obstacles and lead to real changes in society. Each new success and each overcoming of difficulties confirmed the importance of their work and served as an inspiration for future generations in the fight for justice and equality. As the foundation gradually rebuilt itself and began to embrace new strategies, tragedy came knocking at its door again. Even as signs of progress began to emerge, a new wave of problems threatened all the efforts that had been made to combat racism. One dark autumn day, as the foundation was preparing for an important educational campaign, a shocking incident occurred. Unknown assailants attacked the foundation's headquarters, setting off a series of arson attacks. The fire left the building severely damaged. Important documents and equipment were destroyed, and several employees were injured. Although no one was killed, the injuries and shock experienced by the employees were significant. The tragedy attracted media attention, but instead of focusing on the restoration, public opinion once again focused on the question of why the foundation had failed to provide sufficient security. The incident sparked a wave of criticism and doubts that the foundation was once again in danger of total collapse. Less than a month after the attack on the office, the foundation faced another tragedy. One of its leading activists, who had played a key role in developing programs and reforms, died in a mysterious and violent incident. Many questions surrounded his death, and it quickly became clear that it was no accident. Evidence soon emerged that his death may have been linked to the same groups that were trying to sabotage the foundation. This loss was a huge blow for the entire team. The activist was not only a colleague, but also a friend to many. His death left a deep mark on the souls of the employees, and the foundation began an internal crisis. Psychological support, which had previously been focused on victims of racism, now became necessary for the foundation team as well. Following the activist's death, the foundation came under pressure from law enforcement and the public. The investigation into the attack and death of the activist dragged on, and public expectations about the outcome became tense. People demanded quick answers and justice, which put additional pressure on the foundation. The man and his team worked day and night to provide the necessary information and maintain transparency. But each new obstacle only increased public discontent. Internal conflicts and tensions within the team also increased as employees struggled with personal pain and professional responsibilities at the same time. In the wake of the crisis, the Foundation's relationships with its partners began to deteriorate. Some major donors and sponsors, fearing further attacks and negative reputations, began to withdraw their support. This dealt an additional blow to the Foundation's funding, making it more difficult to recover and implement ongoing projects. In addition, some of the former partners began to accuse the fund of inefficiency and inadequate security. These accusations deepened the crisis and made the work of a team that was already overloaded and exhausted more difficult. The man and his team began to feel like they were on the brink of total collapse. The constant attacks, losses, and social pressure had caused them to collapse emotionally and physically. The man, despite his efforts to support and inspire his team, found himself on the brink of depression. The stress and pain of loss began to take a toll on his health, and he realized he needed to take a break to recuperate. The man made the difficult decision to temporarily step back from running the Foundation to focus on his own health and recovery. This step was painful, but necessary for his personal well-being and to allow the team to find new ways to overcome the crisis. During the man's resignation, the Foundation continued its work under the guidance of an interim manager and a board of directors. The team decided to focus on rebuilding the internal structure and security, as well as providing support to affected employees and community members. Despite all the tragedies and crises, the Foundation began to see new signs of hope. The restoration of offices and infrastructure, the improvement of security measures, and the continuation of support programs began to bear fruit. The staff, having experienced losses and difficulties, became more united and determined in their work. The man returned to the Foundation to find that his team, despite all the trials, had retained their focus and commitment. Together, they began to rebuild the Foundation's reputation and continued their work to combat racism and advance social justice. The history of the Foundation and its team continued to be full of tragedy and hardship, but also a testament to incredible resilience and determination. Each new step in recovery and each overcoming of difficulties was a reminder that the fight for justice and equality requires not only strength, but also great courage and the ability to not give up in the face of the most difficult challenges. Despite the tragedies and crises, the Foundation, under the leadership of a renewed team, began to move towards a new phase in its history. The main focus was on restoring trust and strengthening its position, which allowed to create new and powerful platforms to fight racism and promote social justice. The man who returned to work after the break saw that the team had regained its resolve and was re-energized to implement a strategy aimed at combating racism. An important step was to update educational programs and create new initiatives aimed at improving social inclusion and equality. The programs were adapted to the lessons learned from previous crises and focused on long-term change. The Foundation was able to regain public trust by being open and transparent in its work. They initiated a series of public meetings and discussions where they shared their progress and plans. These events helped strengthen ties with the community and partners, and also restored the Foundation's reputation as a reliable and effective institution. With each new project and initiative, the Foundation became more respected and supported. Educational programs began to yield positive results, with an increase in the number of participants and an increase in awareness of racism and discrimination. Young people involved in the Foundation's projects actively participated in public events and became agents of change in their communities. The fund has once again attracted the attention of major donors and corporate partners, who have begun to actively support its initiatives. New partnerships have not only strengthened its financial stability, but also expanded the reach of its programs. As a result, it has become possible to launch several new large-scale initiatives aimed at improving social equality and supporting marginalized groups. One of the significant achievements was the creation of the Perspective Foundation, which specialized in providing grants to small businesses, educational institutions and social projects that contribute to the fight against racism. This fund became an important resource for many organizations and initiatives, contributing to real changes in society. The Foundation, through its efforts, has achieved significant success. They have received national recognition and have become an example for other social justice organizations. The man and his team have received several prestigious awards for their work and contribution to the fight against racism. These awards have become a symbol of achieving their goals and recognizing their work. A man who had endured many trials and tragedies, he found inner peace and satisfaction in the fact that his efforts had a real impact. His personal recovery became part of the foundation's story, reflecting the importance of finding a balance between professional work and personal well-being. He continued to work on projects, but with a new understanding and respect for himself and his team. The foundation, which was once on the brink of collapse, has become a successful example for other organizations. Through determination, resilience, and passion for their work, they were able to not only overcome difficulties, but also create a sustainable platform to combat racism and promote social justice. The story of the foundation and its team has become an inspiration to many, demonstrating that even after the darkest times, light and hope can be found. It has become an important reminder that every challenge can be an opportunity for growth and change, and that fortitude and unity can overcome any obstacle. The story ended on a positive note, with new opportunities and hope for a future where the fight for justice and equality continued, inspiring others to follow suit and make the world a better place. If you liked this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Write in the comments what you think you would do in the place of the main character and the foundation team. How do you see solutions to such complex problems, and what, in your opinion, can help in the fight against racism? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with exciting news stories and important discussions. Your opinion and support are very important to us.